Christian Kirk has been traded inside the AFC South. That's right. Jacksonville has traded wide receiver Christian Kirk to the Houston Texans for a 2026 seventh round pick. And Christian Kirk will become CJ Stroud's new slot machine. Probably replacing Stefon Diggs for 2025 and beyond. We don't know the status or the future of Tank Dell. We don't know what's going to happen with Stefon Diggs on the open market. So the Texans had to make a move for a wide receiver. So they went out there, and before Jacksonville could do anything, could release Christian Kirk, they said, hold up. I know you're in our division. We'll give you a 7th round pick next season in order to get this guy on our team. A guy that's burnt us in the past. A guy that's been terrific versus the Texans. Christian Kirk. So Christian Kirk joins the Houston Texans and CJ Stroud next season. A complimentary piece to their receiving department and depth chart behind Nico Collins. Now, what type of player is Christian Kirk, who is set to make $16.5 million next season, which feels expensive in my opinion for a player that has not exactly been the healthiest over the last couple of years. That's something in terms of a downside. Health is going to be crucial here because Tank Dell is already going to be missing maybe the entirety of 2025. So health for Christian Kirk is going to be absolutely paramount for the Texans. But on top of that, $16.5 million feels expensive for a player that put up a grand total of 379 yards last year and only 1 touchdown. And that's because he missed most of the year. But just saying, the production is limited from recent history. But Christian Kirk is a player I like. I think that he fits inside this offense because I think he's at his home and at his best in the slot. He's at his best working vertically from the slot. And he's a lot more crafty, shifty than I think he gets credit for. His ability to use his agility in his routes and separate, I think, is something that is a strength of his game. 5'11", 200 pounds, not the biggest target in the world, but has often snuck up on corners in terms of that ability to run by you. He has real speed at his best. Now, maybe he's lost a little bit of that because of his age and because of his wear and tear with the injuries, but I still think at his best, he's a good player. 2 years ago, he had 1,100 yards. 4 years ago, he had 982 yards. Just last year, 2023, at 27 years old, he had 787 yards in 12 games. That's 65 yards per game, which would have been the best of his career. Okay, so it's relatively recent in terms of his production. Last year, at the beginning of the year, going through a little bit of a new offensive structure in Jacksonville, I recall him being kind of phased out of the offense to a certain degree. And obviously with Liam Cohen being the new offensive mind there in Jacksonville and being their head coach, they wanted to go in a different direction than Christian Kirk, okay? They wanted to have a different type of slot player, a different type of receiver room. Maybe they thought he was too expensive for the role that he would play. Maybe they had no preference in his skill set, right? But Christian Kirk did have arguably the best game of his season last year against the Texans. He had 61 yards, 7 catches, and a touchdown against the Texans last season in Houston, who was actually one of the best defenses in football. Last year, though, a relatively quiet season. He had a 3-game stretch where he had 79 yards and 8 catches, 7 catches, 61 yards, and 4 catches for 88 yards. But besides that, he didn't really have a great season. And some of that was just the amount of snaps he was playing, right? He wasn't playing that many snaps. 64% against Green Bay, the game he got injured in. New England, he played 57% of the snaps, right? He played, 71 in week 1, 73 in week 3 against Buffalo. So he is not a player that they were utilizing on every snap. And I think that's because they saw him mostly as just a slot player. So you have to take that into account. But I do see Christian Kirk as a good fit for CJ Stroud because I think he's a nice number 2 in this league. I don't think he's a number 1. I think he's a nice number 2. I think that he can work the intermediate and deep levels of the field from the slot position, which is a rare thing. And he's also pretty good with the ball in his hands. Last year, he was graded as the 64th best receiver in football. The year before, he was 48th. The year before that, he was 33rd. So slight decline in terms of Pro Football Focus viewing of the player. In terms of his yards per route run, he ranked somewhere in the 40s, 45th in the NFL, which was actually tied with Jerry Jeudy, believe it or not, this past season. It was also just below Brandon Ayuk and Tyreek Hill, and alongside guys like Jacoby Myers and Jackson Smith-Njigba. So still in pretty good company overall in terms of his yards per route run. Stefon Diggs was a little bit higher than that at 1.84, 35th in the NFL. Jerry Jeudy, 45th. All right, so relatively similar. I'm not sure if the Texans enjoyed the experience with Diggs, if there was something with the personality that they did not enjoy, because we know that Diggs is a little bit out there. There's also the case that Diggs is getting older and Diggs is coming off a major injury for why they didn't bring him back. There's also the case of maybe they could bring him back, but I don't exactly see it as a great fit, because if you bring in Kirk, it feels like a direct replacement for Stefon Diggs. Because if you're looking at the numbers here, right? Stefon Diggs only played 45% of his snaps in Houston out wide. Okay, out wide, aligned wide of the formation. Christian Kirk only played 18% of his snaps out wide last season, which has to be near the bottom of the league. Okay, Josh Downs, Smith-Njigba, and Tyler Boyd were the only players that were lower than Christian Kirk. Demario Douglas played a higher percentage of snaps out wide than Christian Kirk last year, according to the numbers, right? That's an 81.7% slot percentage. Now, the thing with Christian Kirk that will pop out is average depth of target, 13.7, despite being a slot player. You look at Josh Downs, okay, who was the highest slot player in the NFL at 84.5%. Right, his ADOT 6.7, Jackson Smith-Njigba's 9.2, Tyler Boyd 7, Turpin, who is right below Kirk, 9.5, and he's a speedster. Douglas 5.9, Reed from the Packers, okay, his ADOT 8.6, Wan'Dale Robinson 5.1, Adam Thielen 11.7, which is a pretty good number. Khalil Shakir 5.6. Vele from the Broncos, 8.7. Ladd McConkey, 10.2. All these players, at ADOT of Christian Kirk is really high, especially for a slot player at 13.7. If you compare that to the players that are above him, right, the average depth of target, and you look at their wide percentage, okay, Cortland Sutton is right above him at 13.8, 82.6% out wide. Mac Hollins, 65%. Terry McLaurin, 83.9. George Pickens, 77.3. You could go up the list, right? Troy Franklin had 65% of his snaps. He's a little bit higher. Marvin Harrison Jr., 74% out wide. Every single player is above 65% out wide percentage, because usually the slot player is closer to the line of scrimmage. Usually they're working the underneath aspect of the field, the underneath route tree, but Christian Kirk has that ability to be able to be a downfield target despite playing from the slot, which is a rare dimension for an offense. So maybe that's what they really liked here. Something to note, and negatively, is that he only produced a 72.9 passer rating when targeted last year. Maybe that's because he was targeted too far down the field. Perhaps there's something with Christian Kirk that Jacksonville didn't do correctly with him that Houston views that they can do a little bit better with him. Especially, if we look back at 2023, let's actually look back at 2023 and 2022. Because like I said, 2023 was going to be a very good year for Christian Kirk. It was actually going to be probably the best season of his NFL career. Because in 2022, when he actually helped Jacksonville get to the playoffs, and remember, he was like that really highly paid player out of free agency, and nobody saw it coming after he had a 77 catch, 982 5-touchdown season with Arizona to end his Arizona tenure at 25 years old. At 26, he had 1,100 yards, 84 catches, and 8 touchdowns with Jacksonville, where he was their number one receiver that year. He was their best receiver that season, in my opinion, at least. So let's, looking back at 2023, we're going to look at Christian Kirk's numbers and just see if there's any kind of follow through there. So Kirk was a 27.9% wide percentage player. So he was exclusively in the slot again. Okay. The only players that were below him were Curtis Samuel, Rondell Moore, Nelson Aguilar, Jaden Reed, Khalil Shakir, Wan'Dale Robinson, Josh Downs, Tyler Boyd, Hunter Renfrow. All right. When you look at Christian Kirk's numbers that season, his yards per route run was at 2.07. Yards per route run was 19th in the NFL alongside Chris Olave. His ADOT was still very high. It was above 10. So that goes to show you 10.7. So for a slot player, once again, that ADOT being at 10, there's just not a lot of players. There's none, in fact. There's none in the NFL that played as low of a wide percentage of snaps as Christian Kirk that produced a higher ADOT in the NFL. There are none over the last 2 years. Okay? So he is a rare sort of skill set. That's what I think we're looking at here. So it could be potentially a really interesting development for the Texans offense and how they look to expand their offense. Okay? Because they do have a new offensive coordinator, right? They do have a new offensive coordinator, Nick Caley, who's a former Patriot guy, worked with the Rams last year. Perhaps they see Christian Kirk fulfilling some sort of Puka Nacua route tree. Because maybe that's Nico Collins, but Nico Collins is more of an X receiver, right? So could they use maybe Cooper Kupp-ish? Maybe they view Christian Kirk sort of like that too, but I'm just trying to piece together these different ties here. But overall, Kirk's coming off a kind of a rough year due to the injuries and things like that. But I think, and we'll have to see what happens with his contract because he is rather expensive for this season. Will they extend him? Will they won't? They basically had to trade nothing for him. He's 28 years old. He turns 29 in November. He's the same age as me, actually. He's actually a little bit younger than me, believe it or not. He's born in November 1996, so shout out to him. But yeah, he's been in the NFL for a minute. He's been productive pretty much everywhere he's been so far. Arizona, Jacksonville, different schemes, different coordinators. So he's been a good player. He's never been a great receiver. But like I said, I think he's a good number 2 because not only is he reliable, good hands, good route runner, got some speed to him, but also he's unique. So that's something that is well defined by his numbers, okay? And I actually think, what Stefon Diggs did for the Texans last year is kind of overrated because if you watch the Texans play, they spammed him like underneath targets. And it almost felt like early in the season, they were appetizing him. They were like trying to get him the ball, like on purpose. Like it was like they're trying to feed Stefon Diggs. It's screens, very fast, quick throws, and it didn't equate to anything. It didn't, honestly, Stefon Diggs was, I know that he put up some numbers last year for them, in terms of the catches and the volume. But if you actually looked at those game tapes, I would argue that Stefon Diggs was not a guy that moved the dial. That would be my argument. Let's just look at his game log, Stefon Diggs, okay? He had 6 catches for 33 yards on 6 targets for 5.5 yards per reception and 2 touchdowns in week 1. 5.5 yards per reception, okay? The week after that, he had 9.3 yards per reception, 37 yards, 4 catches on 6 targets. Another 30-yard game. Okay, despite having 4 catches. His one, he had a couple big games. He had 94 yards against the Vikings, 10 catches where they were getting annihilated. So I don't know how much that really counts. Okay, 5 catches for 69 yards. His yards per reception went up to 13.8 in week 4 against Jacksonville, believe it or not. 82 yards on 6 catches in week 5. So his usage started to go up a little bit in terms of vertically down the field. 13.8, 13.7, 12.8, where he had 6 catches for 77 yards and a touchdown against New England. And then he had another bad game against the Packers, 5 catches for 23 yards. I remember him kind of struggling in that game. And then he finished his campaign off with 5 catches for 81 yards against the Colts. So he didn't have a 100-yard game last year for the Texans. He had a really short area of the field role, and he was primarily their slot player, as we've gone over. I think there was one game against New England where he took over as the perimeter player. But he did grade well, Diggs. Like 21st in the NFL, that's pretty good grading-wise. So you could look at that. But I think there's pros and cons to Christian Kirk coming in, because I think he's more explosive. I think he's more vertical. I think that he brings more speed. And I think that's a good complement for CJ Stroud's game. If they want to keep this run game, play action focused, I think Kirk is a good dimension in this offense, if that makes sense. Diggs is more of a spread and shred player, in my opinion. If you're going to throw 40 times, 35 times a game, and you need a slot player that can create after the catch and can run short intermediate route tree routes, I think Diggs is probably a better player for that. But if you're going to use Christian Kirk like he kind of was used in Jacksonville and Arizona, and as a complement to Nico Collins at that second and third level, I feel like that is where Christian Kirk can do the most work. I think what you're losing a little bit is yards after catch, but you're also gaining a better personality, a better locker room fit potentially, and a player that will just go about his business and grind. And a little bit younger. What was Christian Kirk's injury? That's something I don't really remember, what his injury was. So 2 injury-filled seasons the last 2 years. But I don't think he's coming off. So he missed 5 games in 2023 with a core muscle injury and missed 9 games with a broken collarbone. So those are a lot better for a receiver. A broken collarbone, upper body injury, a core muscle injury, which is kind of tough, but a broken collarbone is kind of fluky. That is much better injury for a receiver to bounce back from than an ACL, especially at Stefon Diggs' age. So I could see why they made this move. All right, guys, those are my thoughts on Christian Kirk to the Texans. Let me know what type of fit and what type of impact you think he'll have for Houston in 2025 and potentially beyond. It's Mitch. Thanks for watching. Peace.